The frost had come early that year. It lay thin and white across the yard, catching the first light in the way frost does when the air has not yet decided what the day will be. The well sat 30 feet from the house, the rope coiled on its post, the wooden cover dark with damp. A crow called once from somewhere past the fence line and did not call again. He was standing at the well's edge. He had walked out without his coat, which was not like him. His boots left 2 straight tracks through the frost, from the door to where he stood. He was looking at the water, 12 feet down and still, reflecting a square of pale October sky back up at him, as if the ground were simply holding a piece of mourning for safekeeping. Then he said her name, not loudly, not as a question. The way a man says a word he has been carrying in his chest for long enough that speaking it aloud is less a decision than a release. It left his mouth and hung a moment in the cold air, and then the yard was quiet again. Across the yard, she had appeared in the kitchen doorway with 2 tin pails, one in each hand, the way she appeared every morning at this hour. She would have seen him standing there without his coat, facing the well like a man accounting for something. She set the pails down on the step. She looked at him. He did not move. She did not move. The crow called again, farther away now, or maybe not the same crow at all. Then she picked up the pails and walked toward him. And when she reached the well, he fell into step beside her, and they walked back to the house together, and the door stayed open behind them. This is how it ended. Here is how it began. The summer of 1881 was the driest summer in the memory of anyone still living in Harlan's Crossing, Wyoming Territory. The creek that fed 3 claims on the south side of town dropped to a trickle by June and was gone by July. The grass went the color of straw. Cattle were sold off early. Gardens were abandoned mid-season, the soil cracked and pale, the plants standing in it like small defeated things. His well dropped that summer. Not dry, never fully dry, but low enough that by August he was pulling up a rope and staring at the bucket and making calculations a man should not have to make about water. His wife died in September. It was not the drought that killed her. These things are never so simple, but the season and the loss arrived together, and they pressed the same shape into him. And by October of that year, his daughter was 6 years old, and the homestead was contracting around its center like a fire running out of fuel. He made it through the winter. He made it through the winter by becoming smaller. That is the only way to describe it. A man does not grieve by falling apart. Not when there is a child watching. Not when the animals need feeding, and the stovepipe needs clearing, and the cold comes in under the door no matter what you stuff against it. He grieves by reducing, by cutting away everything that is not necessary. He stopped going to town except on Fridays. He stopped answering questions that were not about practical things. He let the curtains his wife had sewn stay pulled across the window on the east side of the house because he did not know what else to do with them, and because the child sometimes pressed her face against the fabric in the mornings, and he did not want to take that from her. The child ate in silence. She had always been quiet, but it was a different quiet now, not the quiet of a child thinking, but the quiet of a child being careful. She watched him the way small animals watch for changes in weather. He watched her back, from the corners of things. By January, the homestead had its own kind of stillness. Not peace, just the absence of motion. The fields were under snow. The well rope hung with a faint coat of ice each morning that he scraped off with his thumbnail before lowering the bucket. The water came up, thin and cold. Enough. He told himself, enough was the same as fine, and he almost believed it. Spring came, and the well did not recover. He pulled the bucket up in April, and counted what was there, and did the same calculation he had done in August, and arrived at the same answer. He was not going to make it through another summer like the last one, not alone. He sat at the table on a night in early January of 1882, with a stub of pencil and a piece of paper, and he thought for a long time before he wrote anything. The candle lantern on the windowsill threw a thin light across the table. The glass on one panel was cracked, had been cracked since October, when he had set it down too hard without meaning to, the night they told him she was gone. He had not lit it since. He was using a tallow stub pressed into a jar. He wrote what he knew. Widow man, 160 acres, failing well, needs capable woman, room and board guaranteed, arrangement permanent if agreeable to both. He read it back twice. It was not the kind of thing a man was proud of writing, but it was true, every word, and he had learned that year what happened when you tried to hold more than was true. He folded the paper once, then again. He would take it to town on Friday. The child had already gone to bed. The house was quiet in that particular way it had learned to be. He sat there a while longer before he blew out the light. The advertisement ran in 3 papers. He did not know which one she read. She had answered in March, a single page, written in a steady hand, no flourishes. She had listed what she knew how to do, the way a person lists tools before a job: manage a kitchen garden, put up stores, handle livestock, repair what could be repaired. She said she had grown up on a working farm in eastern Ohio and understood what that meant. She said she was 27 and had no dependents. She did not say why she was answering an advertisement from Wyoming Territory. He did not ask. They had exchanged 2 letters total. Both were practical. Neither used the word hope. The train came in at 2:30 on a Wednesday in late April. The platform was not empty. The station agent stood near the door with a clipboard he was not writing on. A woman at the dry goods counter across the street had stepped outside and was not pretending otherwise. 2 men by the livery had found reasons to stay there. This was the nature of Harlan's Crossing, small enough that a stranger arriving on the afternoon train was an event, small enough that everyone understood what kind of advertisement a man like him would have placed. He stood at the edge of the platform with his hat in both hands. The train exhaled and the door opened, and people came down, and then she came down. She was carrying a canvas bag across one shoulder. Behind her, the porter set a trunk on the boards. She looked at the platform, and then she looked at the people on it, and then she found him. He was not hard to find, being the only man standing alone with his hat in his hands, and she walked toward him without hesitation. She was not what he had imagined, though he could not have said afterward what he had imagined. She was not tall. Her coat was good wool, mended at one cuff. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they are deciding whether to trust. Not unkindly, but without pretense. He said the only thing that came to him. "The road is 20 minutes. I have a rig." She nodded once. She did not offer her hand, and he did not offer his. He picked up the trunk before she could reach for it, and she let him, and they walked off the platform, and the boards announced each step they took. The town watched them go. She settled the canvas bag in her lap when she sat in the rig, both hands resting flat on top of it. He turned the horse north. The afternoon light was long and still, a little cold, the way April held on to winter out here, longer than anywhere sensible. The road opened ahead of them, flat and pale. The grass on either side the color of something not yet decided. Neither of them spoke for the first several minutes. There was nothing yet to say. The house was smaller than the advertisement had implied. Or perhaps it was only that a house reveals its actual size once you are inside it. 2 rooms downstairs, a loft above. A cook stove with a warped door that needed lifting before it would close. A shelf of crockery, a table, 3 chairs, one of them with a cracked rung that rocked faintly if you leaned back. She found all of this in the first hour without being shown. He carried the trunk up to the room he had cleared, and by the time he came back down, she had located the water barrel, and the flour, and the spider pan hanging on the wall beside the stove. She did not ask where things were. She simply found them. The way a woman finds things when she has spent her whole life in working houses, reading rooms the way another person reads weather. He stayed out of her way. The first morning she swept the floor before he was dressed. He came down the stairs to find the table wiped and the stove lit, and the child sitting on the bench watching her, the way the child watched most things, without blinking, without speaking. She had already found the coffee tin. 3 cups stood in a row on the table. She poured 2, and did not look at him, and he sat down, and that was breakfast. The second day she found the cracked rung and fixed it before supper, using a strip of leather cut from something in her canvas bag. He did not ask what. The chair no longer rocked. The lantern sat on the windowsill above the washtub. It had sat there for 2 years in the same position. The small tin body. The glass panel cracked diagonally from one corner. A fine black line against the light when the sun came through at the right angle. He had noticed her look at it once, the second morning, when she was washing the cups. A single glance, taking it in. Then her eyes went back to the water and she said nothing, and he said nothing, and the lantern stayed where it had always been. On the third morning she came downstairs to find the child already at the table. The stove was cold. She went to the stove, and when she turned back to reach for the coffee tin, the child had set a second cup on the table beside the first. It was already there. The child was looking at the wall. She poured the coffee and set 1 cup by the child's elbow, and the child wrapped both hands around it, and neither of them said anything. He came down a few minutes later and found them both sitting there in the early quiet, the light coming thin and low through the east window, touching the cracked lantern on the sill, and the house felt, not different exactly, but less empty in the way that had nothing to do with number of people. The canvas bag had sat in the corner of the kitchen since Wednesday. She had not opened it in front of him. She had hung her coat. She had found where the dishes were kept. She had done the work that needed doing, and the bag had stayed in its corner, with its neck folded over and tied. On the 5th night she opened it after the child went up to bed. He was at the far end of the table with a piece of harness leather he had been mending for a week, the awl set beside it, and the thread gone stiff from not being worked. He was not doing much with it. Mostly he was sitting in the way a man sits when he does not want to go upstairs yet, and has run out of reasons to stay down. She lifted the bag onto the table, and undid the neck, and reached in past whatever else was in there, and brought out something wrapped in a flour sack, flattened and careful. She set it on the table and unwrapped it the way you unwrap something that has traveled. Then she spread it flat with the heel of her palm, smoothing the center crease, and looked down at it. He watched this from across the table. It was a map, though that word did not fully account for it. It was drawn in 2 hands, one spare and angular, the other smaller and close written in the margins, and it covered something he could not quite read from where he sat. There were lines that followed contour rather than direction, markings at certain points that were neither landmarks nor measurements, or were perhaps both at once. She traced one of the lines with her finger without pressing, just touching. He said, "What does the second hand mean?" She did not look up. She said the first hand was her father's, from before she could read. The second was hers, from after. The notations in the margins were corrections and additions, places where the original had been wrong, or where she had found something her father had missed. He looked at the map for a moment. She said, "He was right more than he was wrong." That was the end of it. She did not offer more, and he did not ask. She folded the map back along its creases without rushing, and wrapped it again in the flour sack, and left it on the corner of the table, which was not where it had been before, not put away, just resting, accessible, like a tool left where it might be needed. He picked up the awl and set it down again. Outside, the wind had come up since supper, moving through the gap between the barn and the fence line. The sound it made low and almost navigational. She went to the window and looked out at the dark for a moment, then turned back and banked the stove for the night. She began before sunrise. The first morning he noticed her out past the barn. He thought she had gone to check the fence line, a reasonable thing, something needing done. But she did not go to the fence. She walked the low ground along the dry creek bed, moving slowly, stopping to crouch and press 2 fingers into the soil. Then she stood and looked northwest, toward the rise where the grass thinned and the ground shifted from dark to pale. She stood there long enough that he finished hitching the team before she moved again. The second morning she went further. By the end of the first week, she had crossed the northwest rise twice and come back with dirt under her fingernails and nothing to report, and he had said nothing because there was nothing to say. The arrangement had not included explanations of her mornings, and he was not a man who asked for what he had not been offered. May stretched out flat and bright. She walked the land and he worked it. The child followed her once, on a Saturday, and came back with a piece of pale clay in one hand and a question about why the grass near the creek was a different color than the grass near the house. He did not know the answer. He said so. The town noticed before he thought to consider what they would think. Harlan's Crossing was not large enough to have more than one version of a story at a time, and the version it settled on was this. The widow man's new wife walked the property every morning like she was looking for something. The woman at the dry goods store had seen her cross the road at dawn 3 mornings running, heading toward the creek bed. The station agent had mentioned it to the men at the livery. None of it was unkind. It was simply the attention a small place pays to anything it does not yet have a name for. He heard about it on a Wednesday, when he came in for feed. A man he knew well enough to nod it said, "Your wife out looking for water again today?" Not a taunt. Genuine curiosity, the kind that expects a nod in return. He said, "She knows what she's doing." He did not know at that moment whether that was true, but he had watched her crouch in the pale soil near the northwest rise and hold still the way a person holds still when they are listening. And it had reminded him of something, the way an experienced man reads weather, or the way you can sometimes tell before a horse tells you. He drove home and did not mention what had been said. That evening, she unfolded the map again, without explanation, and traced a line with her finger from the old shaft northwest, following the gradient her father had drawn. She said nothing. She folded it again and left it on the table. June was coming. The woman from the dry goods store arrived on a Tuesday in early July, pulling a small wagon up the track with the kind of purpose that wore the costume of friendliness. She had a covered dish with her. She set it on the table and said she had been meaning to come sooner, but summer had kept her. She said it warmly. She meant most of it. She asked how the settling was going. The woman from Ohio said the settling was fine. She poured coffee without being asked, because the kettle was already on and there was no reason not to. She set a cup in front of the visitor and took a seat across from her, and she did not fold her hands or angle her chin. She sat the way she sat at every other hour of the day. The visitor asked about the well. She had heard about the well. Everyone had heard about the well by July. The woman from Ohio said the northwest soil was reading wet at 2 feet, near the rise. She said it plainly, the way she might say, the bread needed another quarter hour. She said her father had mapped similar ground in eastern Ohio, and the gradient here matched what he had written. She said they had not broken ground yet, but she thought August. The visitor looked at her for a moment. She nodded, the way you nod when someone has handed you something in a language you don't yet speak. She finished her coffee. She said it had been lovely. She said the woman from Ohio had made a real home of the place, and she looked around the kitchen when she said it. Not unkindly, Fierubat. Chess, just gathering. Her eyes moved over the cleaned shelves, the dried herbs hanging near the window, the tin lantern sitting on the sill with its cracked glass, unlit. She did not ask about the lantern. She put on her hat and said she would come again before harvest. He was on the porch when she came out. He had been there for the last portion of it, not listening, just present in the way a man is present near something he is not prepared to define. He tipped his head to her. She nodded at him, said his name, climbed up to her wagon bench. He watched the wagon go down the track and back toward the road. He watched it until it reached the bend where the cottonwoods grew close on both sides, and it passed out of sight. Then he went inside. He went to the stove and poured 2 cups without looking at her. He set one on her side of the table and took his to the window. The lantern sat between them on the sill, with its crack running diagonally through the glass, like a line someone had drawn to mark where something had ended. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside, the northwest rise sat pale and still under the July heat. He sent to town the second week of August for 2 men with shovels and strong backs. They came out on a Tuesday morning, a father and a grown son from the edge of Harlan's Crossing, who had dug cisterns before and did not ask many questions. She was in the yard when they arrived. She walked them northwest of the old shaft without preamble, counted her paces, 17, measured the same way twice the evening before, and pushed a stick into the ground, at the mark her father's map had given her. The men looked at the stick. They looked at the open country around it. No visible seep, no dark stain, no cluster of switchgrass that might betray moisture below. The younger one glanced at the older. Nothing passed between them that was visible. She went back to the house. He stayed near the work through the first morning, not supervising, just close. He carried water to the men from the old shaft at midday. By the second day, he had returned to his regular work, and they dug without him watching. The sound of it carried, the scrape and ring of iron against stone and compacted earth. It reached the kitchen window in the mornings when the wind was low. On the third day, they hit a layer of clay that slowed them. The younger man came to the house at noon with a look that was not quite skepticism, but was close enough to it. She handed him the map. He studied it for a moment. The 2 different hands in the annotations, the careful marks her father had made along the gradient lines. He handed it back. He returned to the shaft. On the 4th day, at 31 feet, the east wall of the shaft went dark and wet. Then water. It came in slowly at first, seeping through the stone and packed soil, and then faster, pooling at the bottom of the shaft, with a sound the younger man later described in town as a kind of patience giving out. He heard the shout from the near field. He set down what he was holding and walked to the shaft, not running. She was already there. They stood at the edge and looked down at the dark water, catching the late afternoon light. She had the map folded in her hand. He had nothing in his. The older man said it was clean by the look and the smell of it, and that it would hold. That evening the men took their pay and drove back toward town. She made supper. He came in and washed at the basin. The child sat at the table already, watching the window the way she sometimes did when something had changed that she hadn't been told about yet. The light was going. She reached to the windowsill for something to set the candle in, and her hand found the tin lantern with the cracked panel. She opened the small door, set the candle inside, and lit it. The flame caught. The crack threw a thin line of shadow across the wall at an angle. She set it back on the sill and served the supper. Nobody said anything about the well at supper that night. The candle burned in the cracked lantern and threw its uneven light across the table, and the 3 of them ate without ceremony, the way people do when the thing they have been waiting for has finally arrived, and the relief of it is too close to name. In the days after, the homestead began to open. It was not sudden. It was the way a room feels different after a window has been unstuck. The same room, the same furniture, but something moving through it now that wasn't moving before. He brought the second garden plot back under cultivation the last week of August. She planted late turnips and winter squash, and a row of something he didn't ask about. The fence line on the east side had been listing since the previous spring, and he straightened it over 2 days without mentioning it. She noticed. She said nothing. The child began talking at supper. Not all at once. First a sentence here, a question there. Small things, practical things, the kind of observations a 10-year-old accumulates, and then suddenly decides are worth releasing, then longer. A story about a girl at school, a question about whether horses dreamed. An unprompted opinion about the color of the sky that evening that made the woman set down her fork for a moment and look at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something in the same neighborhood. He listened to his daughter talk and did not interrupt her. The well housing took 3 evenings. He didn't ask permission and didn't announce it. He simply appeared after supper on a Tuesday with lumber he had apparently acquired without commentary and began setting posts. The structure was plain and functional, a low roof over the new shaft, protection against weather and debris, built to last rather than to impress. He worked by the last light of the evening and by lamplight when that ran out, measuring twice, fitting joints cleanly. The second evening she was washing at the basin when she looked up through the kitchen window and saw him crouched over the frame, fitting a crossbeam, his hands moving with the particular sureness of a man doing something he has done many times. She did not move away from the window. She stayed where she was. He must have felt it, the fact of being watched. He looked up. She was still there in the window, the lamp behind her, not performing anything, not pretending she had been looking at something else. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back down at the joint he was fitting, set the wood, and drove the nail home. The winter of 1883 came early and left late, and somewhere inside its long gray length, the arrangement stopped being a thing either of them examined. It was not a decision. It was more like a trail that continues past the point where a man expected it to end, and he keeps walking simply because his feet know the way and the direction still feels right. She had stayed through the first harvest. That was the measure they had both, without discussing it, been using. She had stayed through the hard freeze in November, through the weeks when the ground was locked and there was nothing to do but maintain and wait. She had stayed through February, which in Wyoming territory is its own particular argument against everything. By spring of 1883, she was no longer the woman who had arrived on the afternoon train. She was simply the woman who lived there, who knew where the axe was kept, who could read the sky above the northwest ridge and tell him 30 minutes before the rain came. The child had stopped making any distinction at all. It was the child who showed him, if he had been watching closely enough to see it. And he had been. He watched most things closely. It was simply not his habit to speak about what he saw. She said things now the way a child says what she has heard repeated, until it has become the texture of the ordinary. She said the east fence needs checking before it warms up. She said the flour is getting low. She said to leave those boards stacked flat so they don't warp. The phrasing was unconscious. It was the voice of a house that had reorganized itself around a new center of gravity, and no longer remembered doing so. His coat appeared on her peg by the door one morning in late October. He did not explain it. There was a hook nearby with nothing on it, and his coat was wet, and her peg was the nearest one. But it stayed there through November, through December. Neither of them moved it. There was a book. He had been reading it slowly, the way a man reads when he is tired at the end of a day and can only hold a few pages before sleep. He left it on the kitchen table one evening, open to the page he had stopped at, spine down to hold his place. The next morning it was still there, but the page had turned. He looked at it for a moment, said nothing, and picked it up from where she had stopped. The lantern burned every evening now. It was simply what happened when the light went. Someone lit it. The child was 10 by then, and 10 is the age when a person begins to notice the distance between what is said and what is meant. It was a morning in early spring, the ground still soft from the last frost, the kitchen warm from the stove. She was at the table with a length of mending across her lap. The child came in from outside, sat across from her, and watched her hands work for a moment in the particular way she had. Not restless, not fidgeting, simply looking. The way a child looks when they have already decided to say something and are only choosing the moment. She asked it plainly. "Why don't you and Father talk about what you are?" The needle stopped. Not a long pause, half a breath. But the child noticed it, because she was 10, and she noticed everything now. The woman set the mending on the table. She looked at the child steadily, the way she had always looked at her. Level, without hurry, without the faint condescension adults sometimes brought to questions they found inconvenient. She said, "We talk about it all the time." The child looked at the lantern on the windowsill. The cracked panel caught the early light and split it sideways across the sill. Then she looked back at the woman. Something moved across her face, not satisfaction, not confusion, something older than either. The look of a person who has been handed an answer and knows it is true and is only now deciding what to do with it. Then she got up and went back outside. The door settled behind her, not slammed, just closed, the way it always closed, the latch dropping into place with its familiar small sound. The woman sat in the kitchen. The mending was on the table. The lantern was on the sill. Outside, she could hear the child moving across the yard, the creak of the gate, then nothing. She did not move for a long moment. She was thinking about the coat on the peg, about a book open to a page she had not left it on, about a cup set out before she had asked, about 4 years of mornings that had accumulated into something with weight and shape and no name attached to it, because neither of them had needed the name. We talk about it all the time. She had said it as the truest thing available. Only now, sitting alone in the kitchen, with the light coming through the cracked glass, did she understand how much she had meant it. She picked up the mending, set it down again. Then she stood and went outside after the child. The morning of the 5th of October came in cold and clear, the kind of cold that has no apology in it, the kind of clear that makes the distance look closer than it is. She had gone out early for water, the way she did every morning now, the new shaft running full, the rope and pulley moving smooth, nothing like the halting work of those first weeks when the land had still been deciding whether to give. She carried both pails. The yard was quiet. The child had gone to school an hour before, leaving the house in the particular disorder of a 10-year-old's morning departure. And the lantern on the kitchen windowsill was burning. Not because it was dark. The sun was already over the ridge, coming through the cracked glass in a clean line across the floor. But the child had lit it before she left. No explanation, no announcement. And it sat there, burning in broad daylight, like a habit, like a thing that had simply become true. He was at the well when she came across the yard. He had been there already, not working, just standing at the edge of the new casing, with one hand on the rope and his hat pushed back on his head, watching the water, the way he sometimes did in the early hours, as if checking that it had stayed. She came across the yard with the 2 empty pails. He turned and watched her come. She reached the well and set the pails down on the stone lip and took hold of the rope, and he stepped aside to give her room, and then did not step away. He was standing close enough that she could see the line of his jaw in the cold morning light, the crease at the corner of his eye. She lowered the first pail. He said her name, not as a question, not as a call across a yard or a word to get attention. He said it the way a man says something he has been certain of for a long time and has simply been waiting for the right moment of quiet to let it exist outside himself. Once, her name, a fact. She brought the pail up. She set it on the stone. She did not look at him, and then she did, and neither of them moved for a moment that had no particular length to it. The cold air sat between them and around them. The water in the pail was still. Then she lifted both pails. He stepped into place beside her without being asked. They walked back to the house together. The door stayed open behind them. Through it, through the cracked glass of the lantern on the sill, the small flame was still burning.